Good evening. This is May Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 775, October the 13th, 1986. The events that we are all reading in the newspaper are passing so quickly it is hard to understand one article and delve into it at length before another event comes, and they're going by like flashcards. It's hard to say, sit still, time, and let's see what this is all about. Now, what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks is to just talk about Nicholas Daniloff and what preceded the summit meeting and the situations behind his background to get a full perspective. It's not a full because I don't have all the pieces, but I can ask some good questions once in a while. But I'm going to stop relating to other events so that I can get as much as possible into 2 radio broadcasts consecutively. Last week I was just mentioning the running of time, how the hijacking in Pakistan has been covered up, the synagogue machine gun firing in Turkey, the French bombings, all that has been to a standstill for the past week and a half after Mr. Daniloff was out and traded for the KGB spy. The summit came and went, and there are a lot of things I'd like to say about that. The news about Libya and the disinformation continued. The president lying and National Security Advisor Admiral Poindexter lying to the American people about Gaddafi has gotten a lot of flack. The veto on the South African sanctions, the overriding of the president's veto, of course, hasn't been in the news this week. The explosions of the Aryan nations are off the front pages again, and I want to go back to Dan Rather a little later in this broadcast or next week. And in this past week, since we shared time on the air together, Henry Kissinger made the cover of Newsweek. I mentioned last week that he's doing everything he can to sabotage or to put a wedge into any decisions in the summit that Ronald Reagan just had, particularly that have to do with Star Wars. The American plane was shot down over Nicaragua on the 8th of October, linked immediately to the CIA, and then within 2 days, by the 10th, just when the president is arriving in Iceland for the summit, the headlines have George Bush, the vice president, connected to the Contra plane. That came out very quickly. And then suddenly Bernard Kalb left the State Department because of what he said were lies. Well, that man has been so far up to his neck in lies in the State Department, but he's very, very close to Henry Kissinger, and both of them were giving Ronald Reagan a lot of flack when he went off to meet Mr. Gorbachev. I will go into the Nicaraguan airplane crash happening this time. Several weeks ago I started and didn't get to update Jonathan Quitney's article in the Wall Street Journal about La Costa and Lorimar Productions and their links to Jimmy Hoffa. A lot of that we haven't even shared on the air together. And that was September the 15th, and I felt that if you just peeled that parchment back a little bit, you'd get Paul Laxalt, a candidate for the next president of the United States. And I believe that the naming of George Bush so quickly in this Nicaraguan plane crash is counteracting the conflict between Paul Laxalt and George Bush for the presidency. We're going to see a White House type of tug and pull, and I'll do more on that later. David Emery called me this evening from KFJC, or yesterday rather, and asked about that power struggle. He saw it the same way, and in a few weeks I'll detail that for you. The earthquake in El Salvador took place on the 11th, Saturday the 11th. I'm very suspicious of the circumstances under that. I've studied a few mysterious earthquakes, possibly linked to the intelligence community, and I'll go into those later. And all of the activities, not all, but a great many of impressions of activities of the summit, the 3 days of October 10, 11, and 12, I'll update with you later. I did want to spend the month of October and the month of November, those 8 weeks, talking about events that are in the news that pertain and go back to the murder of John Kennedy and the Kennedy assassination. And I cited just last week a man named Dan Rather who had a part in some way in the Kennedy assassination. He had been to Jack Ruby's nightclub. He had seen Lee Harvey Oswald there. All of that going back to 1963, and then this mysterious pouncing by 2 men on Park Avenue that took place just last week it was. Now, I believe maybe there's a connection between what Dan Rather knows in the Kennedy assassination and Nicholas Daniloff, and maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. I don't think it was a coincidence that they ruffled him up, but what are his links to the Kennedy assassination? I'll go into more of that in a few moments. A lot of people perceive the significance of the Kennedy assassination as being a changing point of American history, which it was, in fact. Very few will acknowledge yet that it was a coup d'etat, except the most serious researchers, and even among those, there's a difference of opinion. Some refuse to acknowledge that that's what this event was. And the people who had a role in murdering John Kennedy, or had a role in covering it up, are in the news almost every single day. The corporations like Schlumberger, the H.L. Hunt family, the Murchison family, John Connolly, Gordon Novell, Arlen Specter, the Warren Commission. So I do want to take the people in the news today who had a role in the killing of Kennedy or the cover-up and update you for the next 8 weeks. I'll have other current events thrown in there too, but the gist of the program is going to be the Kennedy assassination. That's what started me doing my research, November 22nd, 1963. It'll soon be the 22nd anniversary since the murder of John Kennedy, and I actually could do one program a week just on John Kennedy and never get caught up on these characters. Now, at the time of Watergate, there were hearings Senator Frank Church had in Congress, the 95th Congress, and included among the many, many volumes of these hearings were about 400 pages of one volume called The CIA and the Media. These were hearings before the Subcommittee on Oversight of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, House of Representatives. Oh, this was Representative Pike's hearing. Senator Frank Church was doing some of the other hearings, and this was the news media hearings were done by Representative Pike, and they were available at one time in the government printing office, but I don't believe they are now. And one of the first witnesses, of course, before those hearings was William Colby, and he's talking about the CIA and the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, these hearings took place explaining the role of the CIA and spying with the news media. But the hearings taking place in 1975 also, because they got caught at the time of Watergate, also include all those years that Nicholas Daniloff went from London, where he was hired by UPI, the United Press International, in 1958, and has stayed with the news media up to the present time. But from 1958 until 1975, when they got caught and exposed at the time of Watergate, the CIA had over 400 representatives in the news media, and Daniloff was in the milieu of all of those people. Now, William Colby testified. He was former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and he said to Representative Pike, Mr. Chairman, I want to clarify some relationships between the CIA and the press and identify the appropriate guidelines for the future, because they got this slap on the wrist. He said it is essential to recognize the important CIA responsibility to collect what is known as overt information. This includes non-controversial activities as subscribing to journals, news services, gathering technical publications, encyclopedias, recordings, analyzing public radio broadcasts and statements of other nations in the world. It includes CIA offices in 40 cities of the United States where they work, and they request fellow citizens to share with their government information they may have about foreign matters. And of course, this included American matters too, illegally in the United States. He said in this overt operation and information capacity, the CIA is merely a subscriber to the product of the journalists and a recipient of whatever information citizens wish to share with their government. To the extent that newsmen have contact with the CIA in informal exchanges with CIA station chiefs abroad and analysts at home, there's no interference with the independence of our press that takes place. Now, that's an outright lie, of course. Just the CIA saying that Oswald killed John Kennedy isn't interference with the press. He said, of course, some relationships in the past have gone beyond these and included CIA employees on specific intelligence missions abroad who served as real or pretended journalists. I've handled such persons in my service. The news reports that they report are a matter between them and their editors. They're not given clearance by the CIA. The reason for the understanding is simple. The function of the CIA is to work abroad, not to determine the content of American media. And of course that is a lie also. Lying, as he testifies. Discussions were brought up of the CIA's relationship with the press and cases of the CIA operating covertly to control what appears in the American press. He said the CIA effort to affect public opinion are aimed abroad, conforming to its mission assigned by a series of American presidents and supported by a series of American Congresses. Of course, there's no limit to what they can print abroad. Then it can be picked up from the London Times and the Le Monde and the French newspapers and papers all around the world, and it becomes fact in this country, although it was printed abroad to slant matters. Then William Colby said, obvious means for exerting influence have been foreign journals and other media affecting public opinion and attitudes and actions in those countries. For many years, clear doctrinal differences have governed such work, differentiating between what is white propaganda, acknowledged openly by its source, the U.S. government, in which case it would not be a CIA task. It would be published, and then the CIA would use it. Then he gets into gray propaganda, and this is one of the areas that Nicholas Daniloff was absolutely involved in. CIA uses gray propaganda unattributed to some ostensible third party. And then there's the black propaganda, which pretends to be the output or even internal document of the target group. While some black propaganda was indeed produced by the CIA and circulated abroad, for the largest part of its effort fell in the gray area, where they printed something and attributed it to one person, and that person didn't exist. It was a CIA agent. He said this included the support of journalists and other media circulating material beneficial to the United States in such larger operations as Radio Free Europe, which was formed under ostensibly private sponsorship to avoid diplomatic constraints applicable to governmental emanations. Translated, that means we made U.S. Information Agency and the Radio Free Europe, Radio Free America. Radio Free America is Nip Tuck and David Emery's program up north, but Radio Free Europe is the counterpart, the fascist element, and theirs is the exposing of that group. But William Colby went on to say and detail, and there are 400 pages of the use of the media of 400 news people in these particular hearings. Now we go to Nicholas Daniloff and his gray area. In the course of articles written about him in the past 3 weeks, I haven't been able to read every word of every article, but the parts that I have read that are important chronologically, I want to share with you to get an overview of Nicholas Daniloff from what they have told us so far, and then if you have a good imagination like me, you might begin to wonder about the missing years. Now, as I'll detail later, his great-grandfather was tried and sent to Siberia because he was part of an assassination plot to kill the Tsar. That's very nice lineage. Then his grandfather was a spy for the Tsar's intelligence system. So he came out of a birth from a team of potential assassins and spies to begin with. Nicholas Daniloff himself was born in Paris in 1934. His family left the Soviet Union with grandpa and great-grandpa in the clink. They got out and went to Paris when the revolution came down. He was taught Russian from his Russian grandmother, who didn't go to Siberia with the other ones. And from the time he was 10 or 12, he learned the Russian language. Now, being born in Paris, he stayed there a certain amount of time. And then there's a time period, a long time period of from 1935 up until 1952 when he entered Harvard. And the only two places that he identifies living are when he moved to New Hampshire before he went to Harvard. Now, he could have been there 10 years and he could have been there 1 week. We'll have to look that up and maybe you can fill in some of these pieces. But he moved from Paris to Argentina. Now, Argentina is where Rudolf Hess was flying down to set up the Fourth Reich in case the Third Reich failed. It's where Martin Bormann was ready to salt money away for the resurgence of Nazism and Hitler to overthrow the Soviet regime for the third time the Germans would try. Argentina was run by Juan Perón, and it was called Little Germany down there. It was a hotbed of Nazis and emigre from the Russian Revolution who were working with the Nazi government, hoping that they would be able to return to their land if Hitler won the war. So he spent time in Argentina, growing up there, and under Juan Perón would be as bad as living in Paris under Adolf Hitler. So we don't know if the family of Daniloff, with their interesting background, were part of the milieu of the French Nazis, or were there part of the time and then went to Argentina, where the German, French, and Russian czars were, particularly the German and Russians. But he was in Argentina at that time. Then went to New Hampshire, and I don't know if he was all 4 high school years in New Hampshire or not. Again, the route was Paris to Argentine, New Hampshire. He entered Harvard in 1952. Those are the years that this Dr. Eliot was very active in Soviet affairs. That was the location of the home base of Henry Kissinger, put there by John J. McCloy, particularly with his interest in resurgence in releasing Nazis out of war criminals, and with his friend, Fritz Gustav Anton Kramer. But the two of them, Kramer was so influential, as was John McCloy, and Kramer was from Germany, and German intelligence and American intelligence. They put Kissinger into Harvard, and he spent formative years there during this time period. Daniloff, of course, is younger, but he went to Harvard from 1952 until 1956 when he graduated. And then he went to Washington, D.C. right from Harvard, where else? And he says he applied for the CIA and the State Department, and I'll go into that in more detail in a little bit, and U.S. Information Agency and Foreign Service. But in 1956, summer 56, he graduated in June, he took a little trip up to the North Pole for a summer job, and then in the fall of 1956, he began working for the Washington Post, a long conduit of the intelligence community, and again, I'll go into more of that later. In 1957, he went to Britain, and then went to Oxford University, and then was hired for UPI and went to Geneva, Switzerland. He met his wife, Ruth, in London when he was there and married her in Switzerland. And then in 1961, he went to Moscow, to the Soviet Union, where he stayed till 1965. And again, I'll go back to these details later, but those were the years of Lee Harvey Oswald and Yuri Nosenko coming to this country, and Marina Oswald coming to this country. In these very informative years, Daniloff was in Moscow. In 1965, he returned back to work for the Washington Post. In 1966 to 1973, that's a nice hunk of time, and think of the history that happened through those times. He worked for United Press International in the State Department, the Defense Department, and the White House. And then in 1970, this is when the CIA was using these 400 journalists for this time period. And in 1973, he stopped working for the State Department, Defense Department, and White House as a journalist and went back to Harvard to study Chinese in 1973. Now, I don't know how long he studied Chinese, whether it was 1973 or 74, but there's a time period after at Harvard, say if he was there 2 years, from 1974 to 1980, 6 years that are totally unaccounted for, where heavy espionage training and so forth could be put into effect after he learned his Chinese. But in that interim, in 1977, he had joined the team that tried to sabotage the House Select Committee on assassinations with John Kennedy, and that's why I think he's so terribly important, one of the reasons. He joined U.S. News World Report in 1980, and when Reagan became president in 1981, he was back to Moscow. That's just a thumbnail sketch in chronological order, because some of the background articles that I'm going to cite, some have one piece of information and the others another, but this is a very significant and important person, and when you read the details on him, and I've only scratched the surface, there's so much to read and keep up with all the other news, you begin to get a picture of why Ronald Reagan absolutely panicked when Daniloff was arrested and would do anything, including hurrying to get together with Mr. Gorbachev to get Daniloff out and home. Daniloff, I believe, working in Moscow, could have a very important role in the Kennedy assassination, and I know Ronald Reagan in California, with his mentors, also had a very good role in covering up the Kennedy assassination, so they had something in common. Now, a very good listener to World Watcher, a loyal listener, and a person who provides information, came across something this week that began to turn my head around about Daniloff and make sense because of all the commotion of this particular person since the middle of last month. He was reading a book called Codename Zorro by Mark Lane and Dick Gregory, published by Prentice Hall in 1977. And this book is about Martin Luther King, and it's about King's policies, how the FBI followed Martin Luther King, and how the inclusion of the investigation of Martin Luther King happened to be put together with the investigation of the murder of John Kennedy the second time around. And there are a lot of forces that have been desperate to cover up the White Russian, Solidarist, Tolstoy Foundation, Greek Orthodox Church of Lee and Marina Oswald, to 28 people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, as well as people in the Soviet Union and people in New Orleans and the Dallas-Fort Worth area that were all of this ilk and had one thing in common, which was to return to the Soviet Union and get rid of the Soviet Bolsheviks that were in power, referring to them current articles this week, the Bolsheviks. Chapter 29, the beginning, is by Mark Lane, and he tells how the Citizens Commission of Inquiry began investigating or getting Congress to include Martin Luther King. And he said in February 1975, he founded the Citizens Commission of Inquiry to urge the opening of the assassination of John Kennedy. And later, they pursued the investigation of Martin Luther King. Now, he mentioned some interesting people who were helping him, and many of them were from the CIA intelligence community. I never trusted Mark Lane anyway, and once he got the King case opening, he ran out very quickly because the Jonestown Klan were going to be exposed, and Representative Leo Ryan, was going down there, and Mark Lane, representing Jim Jones, had to hop a plane and walk out of the committee after he worked 2 years to get them to start investigating the Martin Luther King assassination. He says at the time he was director of this committee to open up the assassination, he was teaching at Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, which is an interesting place for Mark Lane. He tells how he went to Congressman Henry Gonzalez of San Antonio, Texas, who wanted to open up these assassinations and believed that they should include the murder of Robert Kennedy because, as Representative Gonzalez said, these assassinations changed the course of history. They thwarted democratic process. They eliminated options. They baited domestic unrest and caused great harm to the collective national psyche, the extent of which I strongly feel it is Congress's responsibility to assess. So Henry Gonzalez proposed House Resolution 209 in the House of Representatives February 19th, 1975, to open up this investigation of John Kennedy, and he did want the two Kennedys and Martin Luther King to be investigated. And then another resolution, House Resolution 498, was proposed by Representative Thomas Downing. Now, Downing was very conservative. He was retiring as a Democrat from Virginia. He took on the responsibility of this political act, which was out of context for his particular behavior or interest previously when he was in Congress. So there were two resolutions. Either one would be appropriate, 204 or 498, and the hope of various researchers was to get the investigations going and see if we could get more information on the murder of John Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King. As I say, the Robert Kennedy was dropped like a hot potato for very good reasons because of its connections to California and Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan that are even much closer than Reagan's connections to Kennedy's assassination, although those are very, very close. So Mark Lane describes the resolution that was passed by a vote of 280 to 65, and Richard A. Sprague from Philadelphia was supposed to be the chief prosecutor, and there was a lot of action, people wanting to get these stories open, to find the links, particularly the Martin Luther King story, just reeked of a conspiracy. The other one, John Kennedy's assassination, was equal in scandals of conspiracy. So these resolutions were about to be considered by the Rules Committee, and they were favorable, but there was a lot of flack in the news media, and this is where Mr. Daniloff comes in. And Mark Lane tells about in 1977, the Rules Committee reported a compromise resolution on these suggestions to open up. They placed the Select Committee on probation for 2 months to get a modest budget, and then they would bring it up again in April of 1977, and the Congress would decide to reestablish the committee or perhaps forever end any hope of such an inquiry. So in February of 1977, Mark Lane went to Boston University, and he called Dick Gregory, and he said that he would like to have some kind of a hearing or vigilance in front of the house where John Kennedy was born, and that they would stand in silent vigil until the dawn, hoping that these two deaths, John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, would be opened up, and they would represent these two particular interests. So 200 people, students, professors, and others, walked with them for an hour in the frigid winter night from Boston University to John Kennedy's birthplace. It was 19 degrees below freezing. Various reporters dropped in through the night, and one person delivered a message from Steve Krause of the Boston office of the United Press International. Now, that's the agency that is going to send Mr. Daniloff, or had sent him to Moscow, rather, in 1961, the UPI. And the message was that they wanted him to call him, Mark Lane called him. He said, I did so, and I told him that we were having a silent, prayerful vigil, and he seemed receptive and supportive. So the UPI had sent a message to Mark Lane, and he said, we're having this vigil of 200 people, a silent, prayerful vigil. Now, the next afternoon, he said, I arrived in Washington in time to witness a debate about the resolution to open up these assassination investigations. The closing remarks were made by Representative Robert Bauman of Maryland. And Robert Bauman is the gentleman who just finished writing a book about his being gay in Washington and his habit of going every night to the gay bars and literally being forced to resign out of the Congress because of being gay. And he said there's still people in the White House who are, and he's been very angry. This book that he just came out with is very angry. But it's interesting that in Congress, on the floor of Congress, after the UPI contacted Mark Lane, they selected Robert Bauman of Maryland. And this is what he said on the floor of Congress the day that they wanted to open up these hearings. He said that the Washington Post, and that also is the newspaper, the Washington Post and the UPI, exchanged Mr. Nicholas Daniloff back and forth frequently. The Washington Post called the Select Committee perhaps the worst example of congressional inquiry run amok. Bauman then made a charge that caused considerable concern on the floor of Congress. He said, I'm aware of that this matter arouses certain passions, opening up the Kennedy and the King assassinations. Last night, the Speaker of the House was subjected to a public demonstration in Massachusetts, warning him, in quotes, they are watching Tip O'Neill. What do you do in this matter? End quote. A statement from Mark Lane, who had been a champion of the investigation. They quoted Mark Lane as threatening, Tip O'Neill, we are watching you. What are you going to do? Are you going to open this up? He said, when I inquired that day, I discovered that Representative Bauman based his allegation against me on a UPI story. During the vigil, I had not mentioned Tip O'Neill. I had not led a demonstration against him or stated or implied we were watching him. I secured a copy of the UPI that had misled Bauman, and it carried a Nicholas Daniloff byline and read, the night before the House debate, comedian and activist Dick Gregory and author Mark Lane led a group of 200 people in a vigil outside of John Kennedy's birthplace. This vigil is to let Tip O'Neill, we're watching him, end quote, said Richard Feldman, a spokesman for the group. On February the 4th, Mark Lane wrote to Congressman Bauman and wanted to know about the facts. On February the 7th, he asked for and received unanimous consent from the House of Representatives to correct the record. On that occasion, he admitted his error. This is Mr. Bauman, and apologized for an inconvenience to me. I wonder who Richard Feldman was. Clearly, he was not a spokesman for our group. This was no formal group. I called Nicholas Daniloff and said, who is Feldman? And he said, Feldman, you've got me. and I told him the UPI story that carried his name read that Mr. Feldman was at these meetings. He said, I'll be damned. I did write the story. I never quoted Feldman. Who is he? I never put those words in there. I asked him who did quote Feldman. He said the only person who could have changed my story, I can't imagine she would, is the overnight editor Elizabeth Wharton. I called her and apprised her of the fact that Feldman quote was not in there in Daniloff's story. He's right. He didn't put it there, neither did I. And that's the grave disinformation that the House Select Committee people would threaten the Speaker of the House, and there is no Feldman, and involved Nicholas Daniloff and UPI. And Mark Lane went on and said, this is very strange, and Mr. Daniloff apologized. He says it's something that could not have happened, but it did. It was a phantom quote from a mystery person, emerged in a UPI story from the Washington Bureau in a fashion that remains an enigma to the Washington Bureau of the UPI. It found its way into the floor of Congress to be used as a weapon against the investigation of the assassination of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. I'll take a 1-minute break and continue on Nicholas Daniloff. This is May Brussell, and it's part 2 of World Watchers, program number 775, and I cited before Representative Pike's Committee on Hearings of the CIA and the Media the opening introduction of former CIA Director William Colby telling about a kind of use they have of news media people that is the gray area where fictitious people are cited as sources of information who do not in fact exist. And here is a precise example of United Press International using Nicholas Daniloff to try to get the people to vote against the resolution to investigate the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Now, why would Nicholas Daniloff be interested in putting a wedge into the Rules Committee investigation? If this isn't his concern and he's not a spy, then how was he used this way? And the record clearly states that it was linked to Nicholas Daniloff. Being a spy or not, the news media didn't give a breather to the fact that everything is wrong with the Soviet Union and that the United States is right. And the arrest of Nicholas Daniloff unleashed a whole amount of articles. I don't even have time to cite them, and I'll give you some titles later or next week. One of the worst was Haynes Johnson, September the 10th, in the Washington Post, again, a newspaper that Daniloff worked for, called American Held Hostage, and he said after 10 days of silence, President Reagan pronounced Nicholas Daniloff's ordeal an outrage. Another kind of outrage permeates this case, the muted sense of protest that has surrounded it. And he goes on to say that he's been speaking in public places and nobody was even curious about Nicholas Daniloff. In the Daniloff affair, Reagan has reacted in familiar fashion for an American president confronted with an incident potentially affecting superpower relations in the nuclear age. Can you imagine Nicholas Daniloff being so important that he affects relationships in the nuclear age that we would almost bomb each other if this wasn't resolved? And Johnson says, like his predecessors, Reagan found it prudent to turn it over to private channels. And then finally he himself wrote to the Soviet Union about this. I don't mean to press editorial reaction or the expression and condemnation that was swift and strong, but what I want to say, said Haynes Johnson, is the silence of the public out there and not having any anger or seeming totally indifferent. He said after World War II, it's true, we were told gentlemen don't read each other's mail, which was a lie. He said after a succession of once seemingly unbelievable cloak and dagger episodes over the post-war decades, along with events as Watergate, we have anesthetized the public. People are now conditioned to think that things are not always what they seem, which is good. Part of any skepticism is probably involved in the public image of the Soviet Union. It's not the sunshine and flowers that Mikhail Gorbachev wants to say. It is the real politics stamped in the minds of most people. How could the Soviets be so stupid, so heavy-handed, so patently working against their own self-interest, unless there was more to this than meets the eye? And the truth is, there is more to this than meets the eye, and the Soviet Union may not have been acting so heavy-handed, and they may not have been acting against their best interest, as evidenced by the fact that a summit was quickly called over this. But Haynes Johnson says the answer is simple. It is the Soviet way, from the bloody Stalin purges, the trumped-up trials of the 30s, the current era of attempted cover-ups over Chernobyl. The Soviets invariably demonstrate their contempt for the individual, employ brute force as a method of achieving their goals. Nicholas Daniloff is their latest victim, and America will be imprisoned until he is free. Now, these kinds of editorials, this is just one out of 40 or 50, which had such strong language, as if we didn't use reporters for the intelligence community. And just multiply that kind of editorial and article and ask yourself, what in the heck is going on that this man is so terribly important and the President of the United States is so frantic to get him home? September 30th, 1986, there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner, Russian Father's Nightmare Came Back to Haunt the Son. And this is the gist of the article. When Nicholas Daniloff was born 51 years ago, and the family had fled Russia to Paris, he grew up hearing stories of the Russian Revolution. He heard of his grandfather, the intelligence officer for the Tsar. Now Daniloff was going to Russia as a correspondent. He devoted much of his professional career to tracing his roots in Russia, and he worked as a correspondent for UPI 25 years ago, and that's 1961 when Oswald was at the Minsk radio factory, and I'll go back to that later, and he worked for U.S. News and World Report 5 years at that time. As I say, Oswald was in Moscow in 1961. The U-2 spy plane had been down before Daniloff got there. CIA reporters such as Priscilla Johnson were working with Lee Oswald, and she was under the cover of the CIA and the State Department. She was in charge of Marina Oswald after John Kennedy was killed and Lee Harvey Oswald was killed. Priscilla Johnson, under the guise of a journalist, and I'll read you some of the documents from the National Archives, went to Harvard University, to the Soviet Department, and went into journalism. Nicholas Daniloff was at Harvard University, graduated, as I said, and was sent to Washington. And Daniloff, as seen by the codename Zorro, just one example, goodness knows what he was doing in those 7 years, was planning disinformation about a non-existent person because he doesn't want the Kennedy assassination opened up again. And being in Moscow in 1961 to 65, maybe he's afraid they'd get too close to that white Russian Tsarist Minsk radio factory connection that G. Robert Blakey carefully avoided. He was brought on to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. G. Robert Blakey he is the attorney for La Costa, for Modalitz, and he wrote a book on his investigations blaming the mafia, organized crime, for killing Kennedy. Again, steering it from the Daniloff Tsarist Russians in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, in Minsk, at the Minsk radio factory, around the milieu of Oswald, and through the press that were CIA and intelligence. He held the line down the second time in covering up these roots. And when Ronald Reagan was in office in 1981, and Alexander Haig was Secretary of State, and William Casey of the OSS and the Knight of Malta became head of the CIA, Daniloff went back in 1981 to Russia to pick up some more pieces of propaganda, and he admittedly was mentioned by his wife. He didn't admit it. She said his articles were anti-Soviet in nature, and of course U.S. News and World Report always is slanted along those lines. Now, Daniloff says he's writing a book about his great-grandfather, I believe is Alexander Krylov, who spent 30 years in Siberia because of a planned coup against the Tsar, and his father didn't talk too much about the 1917 revolution, according to these brief sketches of his life, probably because they got their ass kicked out, and the Tsar and all those corrupt people around them were forced to leave. But he heard stories of Lenin's seizure of power and the terror that followed in the Russian Civil War, and his grandmother taught him Russian, and he was very anxious to continue his background in Russia and the family, and to understand the Soviets, of course, so they could be deposed someday. And going to Washington and seeking a job in the government, he mentions the agencies he went to, but that doesn't mean that there weren't other agencies that didn't grab him right away. Now, Nicholas Daniloff was picked up by the police in Moscow August the 30th, and 1 month later he left Russia with his wife, and the San Francisco Examiner described, after hard bargaining between the United States and Russia. Why the hard bargaining? Why couldn't it sit 1, 2, 3 weeks, a month? Why did he have to be out in a month? Why did Nicholas Daniloff have to get out in such a hurry? Why did the President of the United States get involved so quickly? And Larry Speaks and George Shultz and a symphony of journalists. And why this hurried meeting of Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev that just took place? Who is Daniloff? Now, Ronald Reagan wrote to Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and assured him in his personal letter that Daniloff is not a spy. And the Soviet Union didn't believe him, and Mr. Gorbachev responded a few days later, unafraid of Ronald Reagan, and said Daniloff is a spy and he'll be tried. Now, Gorbachev has had some samples of Reagan's verities. Forget Richard Nixon. We're told the Contras are freedom fighters. He knows they're the Somoza army, drug dealers, torturers that want to get back. We were told the Korean airline was shot down on purpose, and they knew it was a civilian plane. And 3 years later, without blushing, the far right and the establishment media, everything from the Washington Times, Reverend Moon's paper, New York Times, and all the papers approve of Seymour Hersh's book, which says the Soviet Union didn't know it was a passenger plane. The reason they accept it is then he says, but the CIA wasn't involved. The Soviet Union also knows that Maurice Bishop was not a threat to the United States or the Caribbean, or the runways for the airplanes were not for the Soviet Union to invade America or take South America, that they were for recreation and vacations. And they know that Muammar Gaddafi didn't arrange the Berlin disco bombings. It had to do with Syria and Lebanon. So these are current, easy to remember, overt lies. And when Ronald Reagan says he's not a spy, you send him home, Mr. Gorbachev just didn't respond. They responded by saying that Daniloff was caught in the act. He spent 13 days in a Soviet jail, and according to the accounts, he almost cracked up. He lost his confidence, and he looked like a scared man, and he admitted he couldn't take it another day. Now, the background of Daniloff from the San Francisco Examiner, continuing, says, as a college graduate, my thoughts focused primarily on diplomacy. Neither the U.S. Foreign Service, nor the CIA, nor the U.S. Information Agency, nor the military services wanted me. What he leaves out is there's the Defense Intelligence Agency. That's a very big agency. It's much larger than the CIA. There's the National Security Council, the National Security Agency. There are a lot of agencies that could use him. And again, just being a journalist or studying journalism and attending Harvard for 4 years, he was ripe for some job that would be influential in the Cold War, the anti-Soviet politic of our mentality since World War II. And as I say, in summer 1956, he took a job in the summer with the Canadian weather station in the North Pole. In 1956, he got his first journalism job with the Washington Post. Daniloff went to Washington, D.C., and the Washington Post is a paper notorious for links with the intelligence community. I don't want to digress from the main story about Daniloff right now. In 1957, as I put in the chronology, he left for Britain. He studied at the Magdalen College in Oxford, philosophy, politics, and economics. I don't see anything about journalism or writing courses. He joined the UPI in London. He moved to Geneva, Switzerland, went to Moscow a year later. And from Moscow, he came back to the United States. He stayed in Moscow in Russia from 1961 to 1965. Daniloff was there, as I say, when Oswald was at the Minsk radio factory, and at the time that Oswald moved back to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Marina got her permission cleared quickly through the government in Russia, and he was part of the American entourage, I'm sure, at the American embassy, being so active in the Cold War and anti-Soviet shtick. And in 1962, 60, 61, 62, after the U-2 flight, the first American was tried there, Gary Powers. There was a lot of reason for journalism to be interested in CIA agents and defectors, which is part of a problem in the Soviet Union, Americans defecting that would catch the eye of a journalist at the time. And in 1964 was the Warren Commission. He was still over there, and as soon as the Warren Commission was completed, or while it was being completed, rather, as soon as Kennedy was killed, Yuri Nosenko came to this country. He was the agent in charge of the Oswald papers, and he came quickly to the United States by way of Switzerland, and Nicholas Daniloff was over there in Moscow taking care of affairs for UPI. Again, UPI and Associated Press and all the newspapers carried the stories that Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. In fact, the Warren Commission set up news councils and news reports as soon as their Warren Commission was finished to affect the press all over the world and reach them to assure them there was no conspiracy in the United States. In 1965, Daniloff returned to Washington Post foreign desk, and then he worked for the Washington Post and went back to the UPI in 1965. Under the UPI, he worked for the State Department, the Defense Department, and the White House. Now, in that interim of the late 60s until 1973 were the murders of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King. Richard Nixon came in office 1968 to 74, and Daniloff left right at the time of the Watergate scandals when Nixon was going to be impeached. He worked, as I say, for the State Department, the Defense Department, and the White House during the Richard Nixon years. And, of course, Nixon won the election from John Kennedy by way of bullets, because when he couldn't win in 1960, he was assured in 1968, and he was right there in power. And the cover-up of the assassination of Kennedy that made Nixon's presidency possible in 1968 had to do with what happened in the Soviet Union, the role of Lee and Marina Oswald, and the people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, their contacts, that created the illusion of a crazy Oswald for the purposes of taking away any possible motive that seemed more sinister or linked to the Defense Department, State Department, and White House, and Oswald was in contact with all of those. From 1973 to 74, Daniloff went back to Harvard and studied Chinese as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. Now, missing from these biographies, maybe you've seen pieces of it, I haven't been able to find them. From 1974 to 1981, when Reagan was in power, he was, I don't know who he was working for. For all purposes, he left the Washington Post, and for all purposes, he left the UPI. But he had to be back working for UPI in 1977, or as a CIA person involved with and using UPI, because that's when he interrupted the House Select Committee assassination possibility of being put together when the Rules Committee was going to vote by having articles with a fictitious person involved, his name in the byline, hoping to say they're a bunch of crackpots who threaten the Speaker of the House, don't give them the power to open up the investigations. And he joined UPI in 1981 and returned to Moscow, where he has been. Now, one of the people that worked with Oswald in 1959, when he first got over there, but who was involved with espionage, was Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, a graduate of Bryn Mawr. She got her master's degree at Harvard in Soviet area studies. Fluent in Russian, she lived in the Soviet Union for 3 years. She wrote for Harper's Magazine at home, for The Reporter, the New York Times, and other publications. They took her material. Interesting enough that she had a lot of contact, of course, with Lee Harvey Oswald as soon as he got over there, and he was in touch with Marina after the time period when Daniloff had arrived and been in the Soviet Union a year. And Priscilla Johnson was every bit an espionage agent. Now, I have some documents from the National Archives again, like I shared with you last week with Dan Rather in Jack Ruby's nightclub, and I want to share these with you now and then get back to some of Mr. Nicholas Daniloff to show you that the CIA uses these agents, that they knew there was a lot more going on with the Kennedy assassination, and a lot of it involved the Soviet Union in the time period that Daniloff was over there representing UPI in Moscow, some before and some after. The memorandum that I'm going to cite first is from William T. Coleman, Jr., from the Warren Commission to Mr. W. David Slauson, another attorney of the Warren Commission, dated February the 14th, 1964. That was 1 month after they started taking testimony on the murder of John Kennedy. Quote, memorandum dated May 4th, 1962, just before Oswald came home, says that Oswald had not lost his citizenship. This is when he was going to be giving as a defector all the codes of the Pacific and so forth. This 62 is the time period Daniloff was in the Soviet Union. Another one, March 20th, 1962. Robert F. Hale recommends a waiver of Section 212 in regards to Marina Oswald. Another one, documents of interest in file marked 5. Memo for file dated November 17, 1959. Oswald said that he would soon be trained in electronics in the Soviet Union. This is November 17, 1959, and he does in fact go to an electronic factory in Minsk run by Alexander Zeiger from Argentina, and he knew that he would be going into this factory in the Soviet Union. Now, this position of Priscilla Johnson interviewing him in November 16, 1959 in the Soviet Union, she had a 5-hour interview at the Hotel Metropole. Then the next day, she reports that Oswald, a defector, knows where he's going to be working in Minsk, and that somebody had set it up for him. So the next day, it's in the State Department papers. He hasn't even arrived in Minsk, and he's allegedly suicidal for wanting to stay in the Soviet Union, and they're not going to keep him there. And Oswald knew exactly who his employer would be. Another news story came out. This was from January 20th, 1976. Time magazine is out with excerpts from a book this week written by George McMillan that alleges that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. McMillan alleges in the Time magazine article that Ray is a committed racist who planned to shoot Dr. King at least 4 years prior to the 1968 assassination in Memphis. McMillan writes that James Earl Ray's brother, Jerry, even received a call from James Earl Ray on the morning of the assassination in which James Earl boasted he was going to kill the civil rights leader. Jerry Ray flatly denies this account, insisting he never told McMillan any such story. It's interesting to note that while George McMillan is connected to the James Earl Ray Martin Luther King case, his wife, Priscilla Johnson McMillan, was directly involved in the Lee Harvey Oswald investigation. According to Warren Commission records, Priscilla Johnson, claiming to be an American news reporter, interviewed Lee Harvey Oswald in Moscow in 1969. According to documents, however, her real mission was to interview Oswald not from a news organization but from the U.S. State Department. Critics of the new McMillan book on the King case say that McMillan's maintained undisclosed ties to U.S. intelligence agencies, both of them, and that was 1976, after the hearings of the House of Representatives on the news media. Here's another memorandum, February 14, 1964, from W. David Slauson to Slauson from William Coleman, another one. I found the following to be of interest in the material sent over from the State Department. File 26, the telegram sent on June 28, 1963, in regarding persons who applied for a passport in New Orleans, Louisiana. Besides the name Lee Harvey Oswald is the word no. The memo dated October the 11th, 1963, indicates there is a file attached, but the file is not attached to the memo. The assassination will be the next month. In the passport application, Oswald applied for a passport to leave the country from New Orleans, and they're talking about that passport application he got in 24 hours. It said the only word written in connection with his occupation is this Oswald's handwriting. And then in May 62, when they were about to come home from the Soviet Union, they came in June 62, there's a memo written by Robert Johnson in which he states that based upon the evidence and information of record, Mr. Oswald has not lost his citizenship. I read that before. And Robert F. Hale, dated March the 20th, 1962, recommends a waiver of Section 212 to allow Mrs. Oswald into this country, and a memorandum March 28, 1960, stated that the appropriate notice was placed in the lookout card section of the passport office if Mr. Oswald came back. And of course, as I say, Nicholas Daniloff went to the Soviet Union in 1961 and was very much a part of the scene when Marina Oswald were in Moscow requesting to come home, when the money was sent by the State Department and so forth. Now, one more little bit about Daniloff's background, his early background, before I get on to some of these other matters. This is the New York Times, September the 9th, 1986. In 1961, when Nicholas Daniloff was going to the Soviet Union to represent the UPI, he told his father about it. His father remarked that he was the son of a Tsarist general, and he said, "You think your American passport is going to save you from the Bolsheviks? You are wrong. They are going to send you to the salt mines." Now, Daniloff's behavior is what could send him to the salt mines. It wasn't the fact that he had an American passport and it didn't protect you if you were doing normal things. His activities in the Soviet Union, and I'll go into those, if not this week, next week, were very suspect, and he was found with maps of Afghanistan and markings of where bullet locations were and pictures of certain officers and so forth. He was in trouble because he was a spy. That sends you to the salt mines. Of course, the American passport won't help you if you're caught as a spy, and Dad's warning him that his own father was a Tsarist general, went off to the salt mines. The grandmother, as I mentioned before, taught him Russian. She instilled in him a sense that he would go back to Russia. And, of course, that has been the dream of the White Russians, the Solidarists, the anti-Castro Cubans, Premier Key, who wants to go back to Vietnam, the Chang family wants to go to the mainland of China. And the family, as I say, moved from Paris to Argentina. And I want to repeat again the incidences or the connections of Argentina, because I wrote about those 2 years ago in The Rebel, and I want to repeat those and share some of the things I wrote 2 years ago in case you don't remember them or never saw the article. It was the lead article of a magazine that was just being published on the Nazi connections to the murder of John Kennedy. But when the Zeiger family moved to Argentina, keep this in mind. It's in the article, and I want to just state it again as easily as I can. A man named Alexander Zeiger lived in Poland, and he moved to Argentina, and then by some route became head of the Minsk radio factory, where Oswald knew he was going to be assigned when he arrived in Moscow, and told Priscilla Johnson, who worked for the CIA and the State Department. Mr. Zeiger hired Lee Oswald. He had several daughters who were friendly with Marina Oswald, whose father and family were from the Tsarist armies, White Russians. And when Lee Harvey Oswald applied to come home to the State Department, then he met Marina, and they had a quick marriage, and I mean a quick marriage, no family attended, family or friends. They said the ceremony in Russia, and then he said, I want to bring her home too. And her application was passed over the conditions of the passport office of emigres of this type. The conditions numbered 212. The provisions don't allow many Russian wives to come back to the United States, but our State Department said, come on, darling, we'll move you right into Dallas-Fort Worth, and you'll have a lot of friends, a lot of clothes, and a lot of money. I suppose that's the way it went, because the International Rescue Committee, a group of violently anti-communist people, met them in New York and then flew them from New York to Fort Worth. Now, she came home with Lee Oswald. Her papers were hurried through. At the time that she was meeting Lee Harvey Oswald in Minsk, Daniloff had been in Moscow a long time, and a year, and she married Lee and applied to come back, connections through the Zeigers. And then, as I wrote several years ago in the Rebel article, at the time the Warren Commission was investigating the murder of John Kennedy, Isaac Don Levine came to them with a proposal, which I have a copy of in my files, wanting the CIA to send the daughters of the Zeigers back to Argentina. So there was a CIA, the State Department collusion between where Oswald worked in Minsk, between his relationship in Moscow with Priscilla Johnson, and if her cover was a journalist, the 3 years she was there, and she was CIA and State Department, then how far away do you have to scratch to get Nicholas Daniloff with his background that he has, where he goes from London to Switzerland to Moscow, and he's there, even though Priscilla Johnson comes home by 1962, he's still there, and the favors from Marina were pressed through, and all they had to do was to go up to this embassy in Moscow one day, and money was waiting for them to come home. Now, continuing the New York Times story of September the 9th, Nicholas Daniloff was longing to know more about his family. In order to do that, he had to snoop around with a lot of White Russians and Tsarists, because those are the people his family knew, and of course those are the people that would be hating the present Soviet government and hoping to overthrow it someday. He asked, where do I come from, what are the people like, and so forth. Daniloff is by all accounts the kind of reporter the Soviet security authorities disliked the most, the New York Times said. His background seemed likely to mark him as a probable political enemy in KGB eyes. Because his great-grandfather, Alexander Frolov, was a member of the 19th century revolutionaries that unsuccessfully tried to assassinate Tsar Nicholas I, going back to December 1825, he was a suspect. Great-grandpa tried to assassinate the Tsar. Grandpa was in the Tsar's intelligence. The father goes from Paris to Argentine to New Hampshire, and Nicky gets into Harvard and goes to Oxford. They unleash him in 1961 with UPI. In 1977, he's interfering with the House Select Committee on Assassinations. There they look into the Moscow connections, which G. Robert Blakey, of course, wouldn't do. And he comes home and then returns in 1981 for U.S. News and World Report. And he's described in the New York Times as having a love-hate relationship with the Soviets, and his wife says his own coverage of Soviet government activities was notably critical. Now, some more background on Nicholas Daniloff from the New York Times. He had many Soviet friends. Nicholas Daniloff had a lot of people that were in the Russian space exploits, and this is very, very important. I'm sorry I'm running out of time because I want to get onto that. I'll do it next week. His interest with Russian space, and he wrote a book about them. Now we have to put a search out for a book by Nicholas Daniloff on the space program, because when Chernobyl, and I believe it was sabotaged, I said there were people inside the Soviet Union who were sympathetic to the Thousand-Year Reich, who could make sure that that plant was sabotaged and that Gorbachev didn't know about it for 2 days. I will begin next week for sure, no matter what happens, talking about his interest in space research and other interesting things like chemical, or rather biological, weapons or disease in the Soviet Union and what kind of trouble that got him into. As I say, it's a shame to cut off now, but I'm going to pick it up next week because it is terribly important, the relationship of Daniloff, so violently anti-Soviet, and his interest in the space program. In the meanwhile, this is Mae Brussell. You take care. Thanks for the books and articles, and World Watchers will continue with this very next week. Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. This is World Watchers, a 1-hour news program. It's program number 776, October the 20th, 1986. I'm going to continue with part 2 of the Daniloff story, Nicholas Daniloff, because I know it is very, very important. His role as a Tsarist White Russian, his location in Argentina, the years he was there, his period at Harvard University, with their very strongly anti-Soviet programs across the board, and I'll cite a few of them, and the role he played with disinformation, with trying to get, when Mark Lane was trying to get the investigation of the murder of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King opened up again, that gray area that William Colby used, I referred to last week, with implanting a name of Richard Feldman and quoting him to get into the congressional record, the non-existent Richard Feldman, a la UPI news service. There is so much news going on that I don't like to put it aside, but this isn't putting it aside. This is very, very important to understand people like Nicholas Daniloff, how the emergency to get him home, how Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, was forced to meet Mr. Gorbachev on such short notice. The smugness of this person, the support of the State Department, all journalists around the world identifying and coming in. They had to get him home. They absolutely couldn't have him break down or talk in a Soviet jail. If he was innocent, there just couldn't be that much clamor and acclaim, or even the threat of breaking off arms talks and so forth. He was very, very important. And furthermore, he does link to an area that I suspect is possibly the only one that would cause the commotion it did. And that would be if the Soviet Union knew in any way, shape, or form, and has figured out by now and has fired people and charged them with crimes, people who allowed the Chernobyl nuclear disaster to happen, and the political effect it has had on the Soviet Union that will never wash away, because now we can blame hundreds or thousands or many thousands of cancers on the evil empire. As I said last week, when the broadcast was over, I was quoting a New York Times article. It was September the 9th, 1986, on the background of Daniloff, titled Nicholas Daniloff, the Bolsheviks' Prisoner. And it goes into his friends in the Soviet Union, that he liked theater and music, and he also developed a fascination with the Russian space exploits and wrote a book about them. as I said before, and I haven't been able to locate the book on the Soviet space exploits. Who did he interview in the Soviet Union under the guise of writing a book? Priscilla Johnson went on and wrote a book, Marina and Lee, and wrote the script of how Lee Oswald was supposed to have treated Marina Oswald, a journalist who wrote a book that turned history around, or she thought she could, and her husband wrote a book on Martin Luther King's assassination. Incidentally, it was at the home of Macmillan and her father that Svetlana Stalin was taken. When she was taken out of the Soviet Union by the CIA, she stayed at the home of the Macmillans. So they were involved in that process of bringing Svetlana as part of the Cold War, of lying about Lee and Marina Oswald's role, and lying about James Earl Ray in the murder of Martin Luther King. And Mr. Daniloff was lying about quoting a person who was non-existent, who was trying to place the blame on people wanting to open up the assassination investigation of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King. He interjects himself into that in spite of the fact, or because of his work also as a journalist in Russia. And interestingly enough, as I say, he wrote about the space program. Now, the space program has to include rockets, rocket factories, atomic plants. Now, someone inside the Soviet Union, as I say, a Galen agent, somebody worked for Wernher von Braun, the very people that made the space rockets for Germany, a good percentage, as I said before, talking about Chernobyl, went to live in Russia and planned for a long, long time, of course, the overthrow of the Soviet Union. And I believed that the Chernobyl effect was done by those people who could sabotage that incident. Now, the head of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, wasn't told for several days, and articles, maybe several hundred I've read in the course of that time period since Chernobyl, accuse the Soviet Union of being a closed society where they keep secrets from their own. And how can you trust them when they don't tell their own about Gorbachev? But they always ignore the fact that Mr. Gorbachev wasn't told himself. And you can't force people to tell you something until they're ready to tell you. And if you hold it back 2 days, then you make him look like a clown that never could be trusted. And then the U.S. Information Agency, which is the CIA and State Department, got on the radio and told the Ukraine that you've been nuked, that all this nuclear waste is coming at you. And they waited until the radiation was picked up by other countries, Sweden, and so forth, and then said, look, we know, you're the last to know. And then the credibility of the leaders, as I say, was destroyed. And the only possible way to turn this around for the Soviet Union is to show Ronald Reagan that they understand the process by which we use propaganda, such as the Korean airline and so forth. And you see in the news this week the stories of disinformation and lies about deniability about George Bush and the CIA funding the Contras, when everybody has read for the past 6 years the involvement of the CIA and the Knights of Malta and the Vatican and the private organizations that are directly linked to the National Security Agency, to the Defense Department, the CIA, and George Bush allegedly got Mr. Gomez a job in El Salvador, and then they fly the planes from there. If the former director of the CIA does those things, he's involved in those things when he gets jobs for people within the agency who then say, I don't know anyone in the agency. So with a quick summit that was called this last week by Mr. Gorbachev, he said, come on, Ronnie, let's meet in Iceland. And they met. And Daniloff was never known for a lot of acquaintances, but he knew some well, and one described in the New York Times as Raoul Sagedev, Sagedvyev. Raoul, R-A-R-O-A-L-D, Sagedev. He's the head of the Space Research Institute, and Daniloff was working with him at the Space Research Institute. Well, were any of those the old Punamunda boys or the sons of the Punamunda? Here's Daniloff, who's the son of a man whose father was a spy for the Tsar, an intelligence grandfather, part of an assassination team to kill the Tsar. Who knows who runs the Space Research Institute? I'm sure that Mr. Gorbachev can find out or knows by now. And the article goes on, many of Daniloff's friends were willing to call on the presumably bugged apartment telephone, denouncing the KGB in strong terms. his apartment that radiates out of central Moscow is one of the few buildings not guarded around the clock by Soviet police because the phones are bugged. Well, if they're bugged, I'm sure that the KGB, if there was any link of Daniloff to anything like Chernobyl, and they were going to leak this at his trial, his leaks with the space people, imagine the shock it would have to the Western world, and imagine the way Ronald Reagan had to meet Mr. Gorbachev last week, considering all this that was happening. Now, this article goes on, the State Department couldn't have picked a worse person in terms of his well-known and favorably known personality as Mr. Daniloff throughout Washington, the press corps, and the State Department. This is a quotation of Frank Sieverts, Special Assistant for Public Affairs of the State Department Bureau for Refugee Programs. And, of course, refugees are the nucleus of the anti-Russian Cold War, hot war articles and organizations and protests, and the Jewish refugees and the protest groups. Now, it's interesting that the Special Assistant for Public Affairs, State Department Bureau for Refugee Programs is Frank Sieverts. This man's position is in 1985. He just happened to be a classmate of Nicholas Daniloff at Oxford before Daniloff picked up the UPI credentials to go to Moscow at a time in 1961 after the Gary Powers trial, when Oswald's in Minsk and Priscilla Johnson's coming home and Marina's going to come to the United States. Frank Sieverts is talking about how prominent Nicholas Daniloff is in the State Department, with the press corps throughout Washington, D.C., and the man who says it happens to be his roommate. Now, you go from Paris to Argentina, you go to Argentina to Harvard, then to London, Oxford, and then you work for an interim in the State Department and with the Defense Department and the White House, and Mr. Sieverts, the Special Assistant for Public Affairs there for refugees, just happens to be the roommate of Daniloff at Oxford at the same time. That's always interesting, just a classmate, rather. So the question, did Mr. Sieverts take that Harvard refugee, Mr. Daniloff, in to Oxford, where they both handpicked to work for the State Department after 1965, for the Defense Department, for the White House? Obviously, they meet up again with very important positions that have to do with anti-Soviet anger and propaganda. Now, in 1983, on the 20th anniversary of Kennedy's assassination I mentioned last week, I wrote that article for Larry Flint when he started the magazine Rebel on the Nazi connections to the Kennedy assassination. Now, the questions I brought up in that article, and it's about 2 years, I've never had a response from a single Kennedy researcher in the United States that either said, May, that's wrong, or where did you get it, or you're off the wall, or let's pursue it. And they don't pursue these things, and they look at them with arm's distance. Either they're too lazy to do the work, or they're too dumb to understand it. Some are obviously agents that I'm not supposed to be knowing these things that I figured out. Some people are just too ignorant to understand what it is I'm saying. There's a lot of researchers that still, 2 years later, don't understand what I was saying. Now, I just want to repeat some sentences from what I published. People say, why don't you write a book? And I say, you don't understand the articles I've written. If you read all of those, then I'll write a book for you. But people don't understand them. Now, among other things in this article, I was talking about Lee Oswald's connections to DISC, the Defense Industry Security Command, and I mentioned that when he applied for a tourist card to enter Mexico in New Orleans in September 1963, he was with 4 other persons, and they had consecutive tourist numbers. They departed 9 days later than Oswald. They all arrived at the same time. They entered from different cities. They were part of that white Russian Solidarist Galen emigre community that Lee and Marina mingled with. And again, when he got his passport in New Orleans in 1963, he was ready to take another trip. Without his wife, he wanted a separate passport. He had a wife and 2 children, and he applied for a passport to leave the country that he would have in his pocket. He must have known something was going to cook up because he was actually a good family man. But agents don't have that choice. They have to travel. And then after he got the passport, he was with these white Russian czars when he went to Mexico. And in that same article, I was bringing up links of the CIA to the Kennedy assassination. And again, these go back to that time period with Daniloff in Moscow. Titled John Tower, Senator John Tower and Marina Oswald. One of the most consistent conservatives among William Buckley's Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board was Senator John Tower of Texas. Now, also on the Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board was Ronald Reagan and Robert Morris, the attorney, and Charles Willoughby from Hitler's Kriegs Academy, who became chief of intelligence for Douglas MacArthur. So we're not talking about a bunch of wimps now. We're talking about John Tower of Texas. And I wrote, if there's anything he wouldn't want in his backyard, it was a defector from Russia and his allegedly communist wife from Minsk. Yet 2 years after joining the Young Americans for Freedom in 1962 on the board with Ronald Reagan, Tower passed all waivers in order for Marina Oswald to get to the United States as soon as possible. Without his permission, the trip might never have been taken. Many wives from the USSR are not that lucky. And in that time period, that's when Daniloff was in Moscow, when they were ready to come home, and they had to go to the embassy. And he's from the UPI, and here's a defector coming home, so you may want to know something that's going on. I wrote March 22nd, 1962, Senator Tower cooperated. The sanctions imposed on immigration and nationality are hereby waived in behalf of Mrs. Oswald. The file check on Marina by FBI, CIA, Department of Secret Service, and the Division of Biographical Intelligence and Passport Office cleared her 100%. This is volume 24, page 296 of the Warren Commission hearings. George de Mohrenschildt testified in volume 9, page 228 and 229, that Marina Oswald's father was a Tsarist officer of some kind. I don't remember whether it was the Navy or the Army. And again, the Tsarist officer has a connection to the Daniloff family. Papa, Grandpa, Great-Grandpa, the whole gang. Her real father was never identified in 26,000 pages of the Warren Commission hearings by any name or testimony. Between 1948 and 1950, over 200 Belarusian Nazis from the Ukraine and their families were brought to New Jersey. Both George de Mohrenschildt and Marina came from Minsk as part of the Belarusian area. The Galen Nazi emigres were useful to every part of the Kennedy assassination and to the cover-up. Then the next section I wrote about was the Argentine connections, and I mentioned those earlier last week, just a week ago, because of the Daniloffs having in common the Tsar's background, the proximity to Moscow and the intelligence community, journalists working with the State Department and CIA, working with Lee and Marina Oswald before and after the assassination, working with her after. And I mentioned the Argentine connection of the Warren Report that wasn't published until September 64, yet as early as June 1964, an avowed anti-communist Isaac Don Levine, an arch-enemy of communism, an expert on the Soviet mind, was arranging for the Warren Commission to take the daughters of Alexander Zeiger from Minsk radio factory to Argentina. And Oswald told a journalist, a CIA person working for the State Department, he would soon be in that radio factory. And I wrote, what is that about? When the Oswalds left Russia, they smuggled out a message from relatives of the Zeigers in the United States. They wanted their daughters out of Russia. The daughters claimed they were born in Argentina. They could claim Argentine citizenship, and Isaac Levine was suggesting that the CIA get them out of Russia. And this was from memorandum from David Slauson, May 23, 1964, Warren Commission memorandum, and I mentioned Slauson's notations about the circumstances of a flag being put on Oswald's return papers, but it wasn't there, and all the notifications that he's coming back were not there. And a few members of the commission picked up some of these little tidbits, but they never pursued them any further. And so then I went into, in the same article, Treason for My Daily Bread, and the connections of Argentine and Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi financial planning for the resurgence of the Fourth Reich. If the third failed, he replaced Rudolf Hess' position as second under Adolf Hitler. And in 1971, a French paper referred to Martin Bormann as being behind the Kennedy murders. This was published August 1971, and it listed an international band of killers located in Texas. They carried out 2 assassinations at the German command. This is out of the London Guardian. They said Bormann was linked to the Kennedy murder by way of a book, Treason for My Daily Bread by Nikolai Lebedev. Now, as of this date, I don't know any other Kennedy researcher who's written a book, who's even referred to Treason for My Daily Bread, to the relationship of Martin Bormann in Paraguay and Argentina, to his connection to people who murdered John Kennedy. These allegations fit in with Paris Flamon's book, The Kennedy Conspiracy, and the Torba document, The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. And you can see why Nicholas Daniloff would in 1977 try to stop the House Rules Committee by using a gray matter, a CIA matter, a fictitious name with UPI, just to try and slander the committee. We don't know what they did behind their back, because certainly putting G. Robert Blakey in, working with the CIA, assured that they would never get into any of these areas. And I was writing, referring to this book and writing about the relationship of Otto Skorzeny, working with the CIA, and Reinhard Gehlen, and Martin Bormann, and the funds that were put in Evita Peron's banks that would be shared after 1952. Now, did Nicholas Daniloff family get any of this money? They were in Argentina, avowed anti-communist. They moved up to New Hampshire, sent him to Harvard, and then Oxford, and then to Switzerland. And lo and behold, he's unleashed, like I say, to go do the things he's going to do in Russia, then come back to Russia later, where he becomes the cause célèbre for this big scandal where he's picked up by the Russians just before he's ready to come home to the United States and charged with being a spy. And then the State Department and the press and the President of the United States say, send him home or else this will endanger our relationships. We can't have a summit with you next year. If you keep Daniloff, there's no summit. And then lo and behold, they say, okay, we'll meet in 2 weeks or a week. Yeah, we'll get together. How important was all this? And G. Robert Blakey kept the lid on all of the connections of Argentine, of the Warren Commission, of the Nazi connections, of the Solidarists, of the White Russians, and also the Bunge Corporation from Argentina was involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. I won't go into details, you can read that, but there were many Argentine connections to the murder of John Kennedy. And of course, the shtick of the John Kennedy murder, the press, the CIA use of the press, was to say that because Lee Harvey Oswald had a Russian wife and been in the Soviet Union, he was a communist. And the whole slant of using this woman who was brought back to this Dallas-Fort Worth area, who worked with the Tolstoy Foundation, the Greek Orthodox Church, the whole thing about using her was to use the media to influence opinions around the world and the United States that the Russians were involved in a conspiracy. Now, this intent of the CIA and news media backfired on the very people who planned what they were doing. Sometimes they're just too clever for their own good. And what happened was, by immediately saying Oswald did it alone, as Dan Rather was saying at the radio station, November 24th, the same line out of ABC, NBC, CBS, Oswald did it alone. They opened and closed the case in 2 days and then slammed away that Oswald was a Marxist. Oswald had a Russian wife. He went to Russia. And it was the symphony of the media that orchestrated this thing that demanded a Warren Commission be formed, or a commission be formed, to investigate the murder of John Kennedy. If they had just let Oswald been killed and not say he did it, and had a quiet Texas investigation and didn't close it within 2 hours of when John Kennedy was murdered, putting Oswald in the jail in that evening, having press conferences, he's the one, he's the only one, and J. Edgar Hoover saying he's the one, he's the only one. This went all over the world, and that is what forced the commission to be formed. Now, the media responded too heavily to Nicholas Daniloff. They know he knows too much. They know what he's done in the State Department, the Defense Department, the White House. They were ready to get him home. He had served his time with the U.S. News and World Report, his anti-Russian material. I have to go back now and read some of those stuff. I never took or read that paper. It's worse than Time and Newsweek, if you can believe it. So now I have to go to the library and look up the years when Daniloff was writing for them, these past years from 1981 to 86, to see the lines of what he was writing and what his name was attached to. And we have to do our homework and find the book that he did on the space program. Because in this case, when Daniloff was picked up, instead of quietly saying, well, okay, have a trial, what'd you find on him? the mistake that Mrs. Daniloff made and Nicholas Daniloff made was some kind of arrangement where they probably thought they'd blast the future summit, just as Gary Powers was caught as a spy, and then he'd get off on minor charges after all of this brahu. But what happened was they got so much news media in it, starting with the New York Times and Washington Post and then all the editorial writers, that it actually forced the immediate summit that was never planned by Ronald Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev. Now, what they discussed there in terms of arms and missiles and nuclear testing isn't important, except the fact that they were forced to get together and say a few other things, I am sure, in the interim, when they met privately, and they said no press allowed. So the press of the world took the advantage of 3 days of silence to interview every single person who's anti-Russian. You heard Zbigniew Brzezinski on the air, and Jeane Kirkpatrick, and Michael Ledeen, and Henry Kissinger, and all the people from the Georgetown Center of Strategic Studies, and all the violent anti-communists used this chance of Daniloff's arrest and release to have 3 days of bad-mouthing that went on continuously, criticizing Mrs. Gorbachev for attending, and Nancy Reagan didn't attend. And I want to go into some of those articles and the way the news media covered those events. Now, September the 11th, 1986, San Jose Mercury had an article, An Earlier Brush with the Secret Police. This was written by Ruth Daniloff. 2 years ago, in 1984, Soviet microbiologist David Goldfarb was ready to emigrate to Israel. And on his way, he gave Nicholas Daniloff a book. That's like Daniloff giving a book to Misha. I don't know why when you leave you have to hand people books. They can get the books all the time they want. I don't know why as a farewell they have to give them each other a book. On leaving, Daniloff was photographed by the KGB. The KGB took Dr. Goldfarb to Lubyanka prison and confronted him with his picture of Daniloff. So they've been watching him for a long, long time with his background. Men were sent to search Goldfarb's apartment, Dr. Goldfarb's apartment, where they found some biological strains. And they accused him of wanting to smuggle them out of the Soviet Union with Nicholas Daniloff's help. Now, what in the heck they were doing with these, I don't know. Incidentally, I want to thank Andy for giving me this article. I take the San Jose Mercury, but I didn't see this article. It wasn't in my edition, and I want to thank him for that. There's some great researchers out there who provide David Emery and me with the very interesting little pieces that we miss and don't see that make the total picture come together a lot better. The article goes on, there were a lot of protests from Western scientists, and the case was dropped. Nicky Daniloff gets everyone behind him when these stories come up, and the Soviet Union so far had backed down. While this was going on, the KGB repeatedly suggested to Goldfarb they would drop his case if they would help him. If he would help them, they would let him leave the Soviet Union if he would ask Daniloff to take a package out of the country. Goldfarb said, I'm an old, one-legged Jew. I don't have much time to live. Whether I go to Israel or not does not make a difference. And Ruth Daniloff wrote, we would walk our dog out of earshot of microphones 3 months before getting ready to leave Moscow. Now, here's an interesting part of this story. Because Nick was going to have a spy charge thrown at him. 3 months before they're leaving, they walk and talk where they're not bugged because he's going to be charged as a spy before he leaves. She says Nick's weekend visits with the old man Goldfarb were almost sacred. He intended to see Goldfarb in the hospital the very Saturday that Daniloff was arrested by the KGB. On Nick's last visit, Goldfarb said, don't worry, I'll be out before you leave. Goldfarb's son, Alexander, who lives in New York City, said after Daniloff visited him, his treatment was better and top Soviet specialists came in to take care of his medical conditions. Now, the issue isn't about whether or not Mr. Goldfarb is going to be allowed to leave. He was arrested because of his contacts to Daniloff, but what were the biological strains that he was making in his apartment, this old, sick, one-legged man, to take to Israel? And of course, these emigres say their life ambition is to go to Israel, and they won't let us to be with these other Jews. But as you see, Alexander Goldfarb lives in New York City and not Israel, and after they're left out of the Soviet Union, they usually go through Vienna and they're directly recruited for spies against the Soviet Union. So Ruth Daniloff is revealing something September the 11th when she said they knew 3 months earlier that he was going to be arrested. Now, if they knew 3 months earlier through June, July, and August, then why in the world would he meet Misha in a park and give him maps of Afghanistan if he knew it? And remember, it was Mr. Taubman from the New York Times that went to her apartment and said a reporter has been arrested, and Nicholas Daniloff hadn't even been in touch with the American embassy, and neither had the Soviet Union. And how did they know that this man, a journalist, was going to be arrested, and how did he know from the New York Times to be at the Daniloff apartment? So was this a plan, and it's been suggested in some newspaper articles, like the Gary Powers, to blow up the future summit? As I say, it boomeranged, and they got a mini summit and a date for the other summit behind. So Gorbachev got everything he wanted, and Ronald Reagan will look wimpy to the far right and may even get a bullet for his efforts. But Mrs. Daniloff was revealing that for 3 months they knew that he was going to be arrested, and yet, for some idiotic reason, he meets somebody and says on the telephone, and she says all their lines are bugged, "We'll meet you where we met before," which was a year ago, and pictures were taken at that bridge before of other spies exchanging information. Now, September the 2nd, 1986, there was an article in the Washington Post, and Reagan was still vacationing in Santa Barbara. The headline says, "Aides said Soviets plan to put Daniloff on trial." And this article doesn't rule out the possibility of an exchange of Daniloff for the alleged Russian spy, Mr. Gennady Zakharov. But a few days later, they said, no, we are not going to exchange. He is a spy, and we're going to try him as a spy. The USSR said if Daniloff broke the law, and it's a classic example of espionage, we will try him. The last trial was the American Francis Gary Power, and it involved the U-2, which broke up a possible summit meeting at that time between President Eisenhower and Nikita Khrushchev, and many articles have noticed the similarity of the countries allegedly planning a summit, and then this comes along and would interfere with the summit. And the Soviet foreign minister said the decision for the trial will be in a few days. The matter of importance is that his actions went beyond his usual journalistic activity. And I'm sure they had a lot on him. The editor-in-chief of U.S. News and World Report said this is phony, this is an affront to journalism, this is crude connivance. And his wife, Ruth Daniloff, says it's a farce, it's a surrealistic nightmare. They planted evidence on someone, and it is a crude job. Just keep in mind his background and their adjectives and put them next to each other. We'll take a 1-minute break, and I'll come back to this as part 2 of the Daniloff series, and I hope I can cover a lot more material in this remaining half hour. Get it done this evening, but I won't be able to. It's just going too fast. This is Mae Brussell, and it is a second part of World Watchers, program number 776, and the final half hour on Nicholas Daniloff. I do want to do more next week, but I wanted to do these 2 weeks in succession. It's very important to understand him, and as I say, the response of the administration, of the news media, of the writers in the newspapers, the editorials and so forth, and the government officials, the intense response they have when a man was arrested just for a very few days, 9 or 10 days, the hysteria, and then put that side by side with the background that I shared with you on Daniloff and see why they were hysterical. That's why I did the background first, to give you a little bit of a view of why they were hysterical. September the 6th, Washington Post, headline, Schultz voices outrage with Soviets over reporter. He bars a direct swap of the spies. American press corps appealed for the correspondence release. These are their exact words. They demanded, they were outraged, they appealed. Quotes, Daniloff's arrest impeded the journalists from doing their work and thus violated the Helsinki Accords. This was the charge. The actions against Daniloff are an attempt to intimidate every member of the media community in Moscow. Now keep in mind how many people in the media community, I'm afraid to ask, have that background of Daniloff, with great-grandpa trying to kill a czar, with grandpa in the czar's intelligence, living in Paris even as a child, during the Hitler days in Paris, and then moving to Argentina under Juan Perón, and going to Harvard and 4 years, and then to Oxford, and then being sent back to Russia in 1961, the whole area of Leon Marina Oswald and Gary Powers' trial, and then going back to the Soviet Union in 1981 and trying to sabotage in goodness knows how many ways, but one we know, a typical gray area CIA, the chance for the Rules Committee vote in the in Congress, the House of Representatives, to open up the John Kennedy, Martin Luther King assassination, and both the Martin Luther King assassination and the JFK assassination involved Priscilla Johnson Macmillan, who was a journalist in Moscow, who covered as a writer and author, who worked for the United States intelligence and for the State Department. She was involved with them, with the assassinations, rather, she and her husband, of the Martin Luther King and John Kennedy, covering it up. She worked with with Lee Oswald in Moscow, and was close to Marina as soon as Oswald was killed. Took her to Sedona, Arizona for a little bitty brainwashing, and then wrote a book about them. And disguised, as I say, as a journalist in Moscow, at the same place where Daniloff is going to be, with the same kinds of feelings, violently anti-Russian. To say in the news media that Daniloff's arrest impeded all journalists from doing their work is, again, a disinformation quoted by George Shultz, blasting the Soviet Union at Harvard University, and not mentioning, I don't believe in what I read, that Nicholas Daniloff graduated from there, along with the ilk of Priscilla Johnson and Henry Kissinger, and many of the other anti-communists at Harvard University, but suggesting that arrest impeded all journalists, or that every member of the media in Moscow is in danger because Daniloff was arrested when he was working with space people, with the space program, with the biological weapons, with Tsarist white Russians, with refuseniks who want to get out of there, whose sympathies are with them. They put him in a ball of wax as all the others, but they don't have the honesty to tell you his background. They just tell you that if you take Daniloff, then no journalist is safe, which is another disinformation lie occurring right now at Harvard University, celebrating their 350th anniversary. George Shultz used the speech to blast the Soviet Union and talk about Nicholas Daniloff. The New York Times, September the 6th, 1986, is titled, "Shultz Demands the Soviet Free the U.S. Journalist." The other article from the Washington Post was Shultz voices outrage with the Soviets. These are same articles the same day from different newspapers using different words, and he tells the public to be aware of this crisis and warns that Daniloff could soon begin to jeopardize Soviet-American relations. As again, this is only on the 6th of September. He's only been arrested August the 30th, and these adjectives are so important. The Secretary of State has an outrage. The Secretary of State demands. The U.S.-USA relations are in danger. As I say, who is he? It's just been 6 days. Washington Post, September the 7th. Ruth Daniloff's diary, headline, "I feel terrified for Nick." She says his cellmate is clearly a plant in the prison there, and that even though he was caught with 2 maps that were marked top secret, it isn't a big deal, and she feels terrified. She feels terrified, and he said if Reagan hadn't gotten him out, he would have been many years in the Soviet Union. They all knew he was guilty. They knew the things that he had done in the past that none of us know, and things that he was doing at the time. And it depended upon the President of the United States to jump in with the Secretary of State and every figure of speech, known and well-known, and some unknown editorial writers, and the surprising, in quotes, liberal left pounding on this, unanimous in the importance of Daniloff. And again, at the time of the William Colby hearings in Representative Pike's congressional hearings, there were 400 news people at the time working for the CIA, and Daniloff in those earlier periods when he went from 1961 and then working up until 75, That was supposed to stop, but again in 1977 he's used by the UPI and quoted by Mark Lane. Now, September the 8th, Washington Post. Daniloff is indicted as a spy by the Soviets, and Russia warned the United States there are serious implications for the United States. The Soviet Union said, we're going to indict him, we have, and there are serious implications. And it's that turning point, September the 8th, where there is absolute hysteria about what is going on with Daniloff. We've got to get him out. It got so bad that by September the 18th or 19th, Mr. Shevardnadze was called to the White House, and I'll get to that, I hope so, in this half hour. The second part of this article, Washington Post, September the 8th, Larry Speaks was quoted, "The journalist is innocent. No trade possible, he's innocent." And then a quotation of parts of a letter sent by Ronald Reagan. Last week, a personal letter was sent to Gorbachev from Ronald Reagan. Free Daniloff, he's not a spy. The Secretary of State, the President of the United States, and his spokesperson, Larry Speaks. The journalist is innocent, one says. The other says he's not a spy. And the Soviets get a letter from Ronald Reagan a week earlier, and 7 days later they say he's indicted as a spy, which means we don't care what you think, Ronald Reagan. We don't care what you think, George Shultz or Larry Speaks. He has been indicted, and the letter from the president doesn't mean a thing. That was a week before that Ronald Reagan wrote, and they indicted him. Soviet Gerasimov, I don't know if I pronounced this right, charged that Daniloff doesn't deny the things he got in this envelope that were marked secret. Daniloff could stand a 6 months investigation, they said, and that he went to his meetings on his own will. He made this step, he has to take the consequences, and he hadn't said if there was money that he exchanged for the maps that he got. September the 8th, New York Times, and I quoted two Washington Post stories, one from the 7th and one from the 8th, titled headlines, Impact of Case Called Serious by the White House. It gets very serious because Ronald Reagan wrote immediately to Gorbachev and said, let him out, he's not a spy. And 7 days later, they say, we indicted him. So now it's really serious. Impact of case called serious. Reagan is described as concerned on Daniloff. Now, Reagan, remember, in 1960 was put on the board of Young Americans for Freedom. Those very people were involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. They were involved with CIA activities that was set up by William Buckley and Douglas Caddy, whose offices were used for the Watergate payments, and the former CIA, James McCord and E. Howard Hunt, and the rest that were all CIA that they called former CIA there. And then the White House got very concerned because what if he is tried as a spy? He can't be that innocent if they're so concerned. It's impossible. So then the article goes on, Shultz and Eduard Shevardnadze, the Soviet minister, will meet September the 19th and 20th to set a date for the meeting summit in the United States of Mr. Gorbachev. So there was no intention, September the 8th, to put Mr. Shevardnadze into the White House, where he was pressured by Ronald Reagan, and as a consequence, Gorbachev sent a letter and said, well, let's get off to Iceland and talk about this thing. The adjectives are terrified, serious, concerned, extremely distressed, and psychological pressure that is being put on Daniloff, and I'm sure on a lot of other people, including the President of the United States, the State Department, and the CIA. Now, this one article from the New York Times continues. This is the September the 8th. Jailed American charged in Soviet as being a spy. The Washington Post had that title too, and formal accusation made. The move against the correspondent was made despite a letter from Reagan on his innocence, and that was in the headlines, those big letters by Felicity Behringer. So they announced right there, if you don't have to have it translated, as I did with the earlier article, that the USSR believes that Reagan is lying. And what would the Soviet Union have to gain by creating a false story of making Daniloff a lie and aggravating the United States, who are always trying to prove them an evil empire? Daniloff was charged with espionage. The actions were taken at a time when the Soviet Union wanted to arrange a summit conference, and this is pointed out in the article. And then there's a quotation of the foreign minister from the Soviet Union. If you think he's innocent, you can learn pretty well soon there is going to be a trial. You can learn pretty soon, rather. There's going to be a trial. And he said this particular envelope was not the only thing we have against Daniloff, not the envelope he got from Misha with the maps marked top secret. We've had other problems with Daniloff before. And they referred to Professor Frederick Barghorn, Barghorn, from Yale, who was arrested and spying in the Soviet Union. A man had put papers in his hand. They were rolled up. He was seized by the security and charged with having classified information. And his arrest came 3 days, came after 3 Russians and American were arrested in the United States, and they were traded and released. That release was arranged November 16th after John Kennedy declared the Russian spy from Yale to be innocent. And then this article concludes from the New York Times, if they go ahead and try and sentence him, it's a personal insult to Ronald Reagan. Now, considering Ronald Reagan's role in the Kennedy assassination, his mentor, Patrick Frawley, employed Mr. Butler in New Orleans, who made a record with Oswald Ed Butler, saying, I am a Marxist, the cover for influencing the media to switch it to a communist Cold War lying story that Mr. Khrushchev knew at the time wasn't true. Oswald wasn't a Marxist in the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan would not extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley to Jim Garrison's trial, and he worked closely with the very people involved in the murder of John Kennedy and the cover-up of John Kennedy. So the way that this is twisted, and the news is very important, the way it's twisted around, it's the way they say if you arrest Nicholas Daniloff for being a spy, then no other newspaper reporter in Moscow is ever safe, which is a lie. Now they're saying if you go ahead and sentence him, and the president told you not to, that he's not a spy, then you are personally insulting Ronald Reagan. And how bad can that be for the Soviet Union when he's such a popular president? To personally insult him. Well, obviously, Mr. Gorbachev wasn't worried about insulting Ronald Reagan when you consider the insults that they have taken over and over again. And the New York Times article concluded, Western journalists are in a furor over Daniloff case. USSR said he has been made a hero of the day by the Western propaganda, and they were saying in the newspapers in Russia, Izvestia and other papers, that they made a hero out of him, which they wanted to do. Me think thou protest too much. The quotation, the Soviet Union was watching a massive symphony orchestrated about the innocence of Daniloff from everybody who has a fountain pen and can write, or a typewriter, or a computer. And he became a total hero in the United States that everybody wanted to free. U.S. News and World Report were selling sweatshirts. Free Nicholas Daniloff. And the Soviet Union said that Daniloff was made to appear as naive, innocent victim of the tyranny of Soviet Russia and their authorities, and they make him appear as if he were a pawn in their political game of chess. That diabolical thing, again, of I am an innocent man. Interestingly enough, remember that it was Mrs. Daniloff who said that 3 months earlier they knew there was going to be an arrest. But that was synchronized with the news media and carried out, and as I say, it boomeranged in many ways. Another article from September the 8th, continuing the New York Times, a large heading, a long ordeal forecast for reporter. Oh, this is a different story, September the 8th, New York Times, by Harold J. Berman. And this, again, is one of these slanted articles out of Harvard, by a Harvard law professor. He was there from 1948. The CIA was formed in 1947 until 1985, last year. And he now teaches at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, an interesting place to be. And he was cited in the New York Times. Nicholas Daniloff can face a long ordeal if the United States and USSR do not make political arrangements to free him. In other words, get off your butt, because if you don't do something, it's going to be late. He's definitely going to be locked in the clink for a long time. Now the question, what is the hurry to get him out, that they used all of these ploys to say it's essential that we get him out, it's important that we get him out. And then there's another question that comes up again with the chronology that I gave last week on the chronology of Nicholas Daniloff. Where was he from 1973 to 1981? these eager beaver reporters find certain dates that they can locate him, but it doesn't say who he worked for in that time period. Now, he worked for UPI or with them or around them, obviously, in January of 1977 when this letter was sent, or article by UPI, that the people wanting to open up the investigation of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King were threatening Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House, which didn't happen, in fact, and was traced to Daniloff on the very day they're going to vote whether the Rules Committee can investigate these murders. So this was a byline of the UPI. But where else was he? And if we know where he was from 1973 until 1981, it would give an important part of why they were so hysterical. Because part of this time period I mentioned, he worked with the State Department, the White House, and the Defense Department. And he touched all bases. And his former classmate from Oxford was in charge of emigres from the Soviet Union. And we had a lot of them and a lot of propaganda and press coverage through these years about the emigres wanting to come here. Now, Harold Berman, who was at Harvard teaching law, said he made fun of the Soviet system of law, and he wrote a book called Soviet Criminal Law and Procedures. And quoted in the New York Times are some remarks of his. He said, the USSR makes their own laws, and they want them obeyed. They're eager to give their system legitimacy in the eyes of their own people and in the eyes of the world, even though the law is abused when important political considerations come to the fore. Now, he's an expert on Soviet law from Harvard, 1948 to 1985, that whole time span of the anti-Soviet departments there. But in a book written by Seymour Melman about Nazi Germany, he went into great lengths on how law was perverted from 1922 until Hitler was elected in 1933. Then there were no more laws. And how they had to make the courts appear to be working and legitimate, where guilty people and involving political assassinations and liberals and the left, and changing the fabric of Germany from the Weimar Republic into Hitler's fascist Third Reich. The guilty, the assassins and the people involved in murders were out, and the innocent were locked up, and one of their largest problems was perverting the court. Now, the minute the war was over, we hired Reinhard Gehlen, who, with his family, his brother and families, worked in the process of covert action for Adolf Hitler that was part of this operation of assassination and cover-up. And we took these jurists and these lawyers and made them our co-workers and worked with them, forming our intelligence community, and with Reinhard Gehlen. And we put Gehlen back over there in charge of the intelligence, the BND. And there never was a critique or a criticism of the legal establishment that worked with the United States from those early days on to the present day, and international legal meetings and so forth. So there's no objection to persons in the OSS, CIA, the American Bar Association, such as Leon Jaworski, who was president of the American Bar Association, being an attorney advisor to the Warren Commission and outright lying on the murder of John Kennedy and naming a false Patsy Lee Oswald when the connections were so much bigger. The inconsistency of people like Harold Berman looking the other way while we have pathological liars in the legal profession, and then accusing the Soviet Union. And I don't want you to think I think the Soviet Union's perfect, but it is nauseating to see the establishment people cited when crises come out like this, such as bad-mouthing what they do in Russia when we accept it. Mr. Pinochet has no great legal system, nor does the president in South Korea or Mr. Zia in Pakistan, and our allies, the Chang family in Taiwan, you name it. And the military dictatorships we had with Klaus Barbie and his gang in Bolivia, and the military dictatorship that Vernon Walters and the CIA put in Brazil. There were no legal systems there, and there was no legitimacy in the eyes of the people anywhere in the world about the legal systems in the dictatorships, such as the Savak ran for the Shah of Iran after the CIA put him in, and I could cite 44 countries going this way. So when Daniloff is arrested, this professor from law, who's the expert on Soviet Union, tells you that he will naturally be convicted because they will forge the evidence, and that's the way they work. Nobody's innocent in Russia because they write their own laws. Just forgetting the whole background of Daniloff and all the bases he touched. God forbid there was some reason for for the Russians to believe and stand up to the fact that he was a spy, and that's what they chose to do. Now, in the same article, Professor Leon Lipson from Yale University, is quoted. He's an expert on the Soviet legal system. He said, if the Soviet Union continues to make the advances in civil liberties and legal procedures it made since the 1940s and 50s, we can look forward to the day, perhaps in 25 years, when it reaches the level of Franco Spain. Now, again, the Vatican and Germany and the United States liked Franco Spain. They supported him. Charles Willoughby, the head of intelligence for Douglas McCarthy, the real Wiedenbach, his name is, from Germany, he got Congress to give Franco over $35 million, and we gave him many, many millions more than that. We never asked for trials and juries in Franco Spain. He was an ally of ours. We appreciated his relationship, just as Marcos of the Philippines, and the legal systems there. You could compare the dictatorships that we have supported and put into power and compare them to the Soviet system. And if you're going to level these charges and use these experts from Yale and Harvard who make themselves experts, then the public has to be reminded of the outright hypocrisy of these people pulling this. Every time there's a crisis, they come out of the woodwork with their pat answers, and every time they do that, it gets us psychologically ready to go to war. Now, September 8th, the New York Times had an article by Anthony Lewis, What Gorbachev Risks. He says the stakes are high in the Daniloff affair. Gorbachev sent many signals, but he's ready to deal. First, he says he's ready to deal, and then he's ready to have the trial. He can't be open. He assumed the leadership of the Soviet Union that he would be open. He blew that hollow claim with the Chernobyl disaster. And keep in mind Daniloff's close relationships to the space industry and I presume, the astronauts and scientists in Russia. He says, how can we deal with a system that resorts to transparent inventions as planted evidence as spying? Anthony Lewis, given the background of Daniloff that I've shared with you last week and this week, these are transparent inventions and planted evidence. He said, if Daniloff charges are pressed, no American would go to a summit conference. If you charge Daniloff, what if something came out at the trial? What if the Soviet Union knows about any possible links to Chernobyl? What do they know about him? When Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald were there, Anthony Lewis is saying if the Soviet Union pressed charges, no one should go to a summit conference. You shouldn't talk about arms reduction, Star Wars, atomic testing. The most important thing, the litmus paper, is Daniloff. We've got to get him home. Now, that's a lot of nervousness. That's a lot of anxiety. The New York Times the next day had a story, Soviet indicates Daniloff faces wider charges. Now, that makes it worse because they're past those maps and so forth. And the article says the USSR will link Daniloff to an American diplomat expelled last year. I mentioned him, Paul Stambaugh, and then it went in about Daniloff's contacts with Misha. He first met in 1982, and then he met a year later, and on the telephone, as I say, they agreed to meet at a certain place. And this article about further charges said Daniloff allegedly requested military information relating to Afghanistan, photographs of Soviet military equipment, names and addresses of soldiers who fought in Afghanistan for the Soviets, the location of military units prepared for action in Afghanistan. Now, when Lee Harvey Oswald returned from the Soviet Union with his wife, June 1962, they went to Fort Worth, and before they could barely unpack their few meager belongings, and allegedly had no money and kept their baby named June in the drawer of a bureau, opened, of course, not closed, he went to a secretary named Pauline Bates, and he dictated about Soviet troop movements and tanks and observances from airplanes from ground level and so forth, things that he was able to see going out to the country on the weekends, working at the Minsk radio factory run by Mr. Zeiger from Argentina, who is closely affiliated with our Central Intelligence Agency. This very poor Lee Harvey Oswald goes to the American Embassy in Moscow, and they give him money for him and his wife to come home, and he did indeed keep his citizenship. All that stuff about giving the Soviet Union secrets of the Marines was a bunch of BS. And he was privy to secrets enough to go to a secretary, and there were affidavits of Pauline Bates when the Warren Commission hearings were taken. The first plans were for the Texas courts to investigate the murder of Kennedy, or there would be no Pauline Bates that we know about. The only reason we know about these people, again, is that the news media synchronized, blamed the Soviet Union and Russia and Fidel Castro for the murder of Kennedy. Nobody around the world believed it, so Lyndon Johnson had to form a commission upon which he put Allen Dulles of the Central Intelligence Agency, former director fired by John Kennedy, and John J. McCloy, who had been in Paris for 10 years before World War II broke out, represented the law interests of I.G. Farben, worked for and on the board of Chase Manhattan Bank, and then released the top Nazis out of Germany in a very short time after the Nuremberg trial so that they could all meet again in Argentina and Peru and Brazil and Bolivia and Paraguay and so forth and begin their resurgence of the Fourth Reich. Now, another article, December the 9th, Moscow levels new charges, and then it goes on, the Soviet government has extended the hard line even further. The New York Times had one story, Daniloff faces wider charges. The Washington Times is the Reverend Moon paper. The charges go even further. The new charges will carry a penalty of 15 years, sometimes life. It is not clear if the Daniloff case will lead to a cancellation and proposed summit later this year. That was written September the 9th. Little did they know that by October, Gorbachev would be meeting with Ronald Reagan because all of the junk they were writing forced a meeting, and Daniloff was the numero uno issue, and in strategic places at the right time made it very impossible that he could stand trial. And also, if there was a connection between Reagan's friends and Young Americans for Freedom and the Moscow clink, which those relationships can be tied together, Reagan would want him home, and Daniloff was not somebody to be kept in the Soviet Union. Ruth Daniloff said in the Washington Times, "It's just for domestic consumption, the new charges. While this case is being decided," she said, "at a much higher level." Now, she knows about that. She was at Oxford when he was there in England and accompanied him to the Soviet Union 2 times. And then she reveals parts of herself in the articles that she has published. I wish I had more time just to talk about Ruth Daniloff, because unknowingly she lets things out, such as saying we knew for 3 months that he was going to be arrested by the KGB. And then she says that these charges are something that involve a much higher level, and you can believe they do. And the only thing that comes to my mind that would be so important, in addition to where he was before in Russia, was his link to the Soviet space program and the catastrophe at Chernobyl that I believed, as I say, was a sabotage to put them in the position they're in, which is defensive ever since. There was a call to Daniloff, she said, and quote in the newspaper, from this Misha who said, "I am Prince, let's meet at the usual place at 11 o'clock under the Iron Bridge." And, of course, knowing that for 3 months you're going to be arrested, it's interesting that you would answer to somebody that you haven't seen for a year. And then Daniloff has handed a map of Afghanistan, marked secret, and, as I say, pictures of military hardware and so forth. Now, the hysteria of the newspaper, I don't have time to go through some of the top articles. I have about 20 titles here. Just the titles alone are very, very important to show the importance of Daniloff. But this hour is over again, and probably next week I'll do part 3, at least a half hour, on Nicholas Daniloff, and then get back to some of the other news that has been taking place or has taken place the last 2 weeks, and get back to that. But I do want to continue on this man because I think he's more important than any of us know, but the powers that be know that fact and make it quite clear. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell. The program is called World Watchers, and I'll be back with you next week.